everybody. Karen Roby here for Tech Republic, talking today with David Crandall. David's an assistant professor of computer science at IU. David, thanks for being with me here today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So, we're going to talk about AI, a couple different facets here. Just start with, tell our audience here the type of classes that you're teaching and your focus.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a computer scientist and I sort of work on the algorithms, the technologies underneath AI. And I work specifically in machine learning and computer vision. Computer vision is kind of the area that tries to, get cameras that are able to see the world in the way that people do. And that then could power a lot of different AI technologies from robotics to autonomous vehicles to many other things.
So, talk about, David, where we are right now with AI. Are we where you thought that we would be at this point? Are we moving past it? I mean, a lot of companies we're learning now are having to put, projects, AI projects on fast forward because of the pandemic and really accelerate their use of it. Are you seeing that?
Well, I think it's a really exciting time in general for the field, but I'd also say it's kind of a confusing time because, even in my lab, we often encounter problems that we think are going to be very hard, and then it turns out that they're very easy for AI. And then on the other hand, we also encounter problems that we think are going to be easy, no problem, and then they turn out to be extremely difficult to solve. And I think that's kind of an interesting place where we're in right now with AI, right? Right. We have like, programs that can play chess better than any human who can ever live, but we have, robots that still make simple decisions. Like, there was a year or two ago, there was a case of a security robot in a mall that like didn't see a fountain in front of it and just like ran right into it and drowned itself. So it's just sort of super confusing how like we can have machines that are so powerful on one hand and so kind of confusing on the other hand. I think in terms of the pandemic specifically, I think that there's still a lot of interest in AI as there was before, but the fact that we're doing most meetings online now and so much of our life has become virtual, I think has just increased interest in AI and in technology in general.
Absolutely. All eyes are certainly on, technology in every industry, every space. So, David, talk a little bit about, we hear a lot about the ethical use of AI, and what does that mean to you? And where are we when it comes to ethics and AI and how people perceive this technology?
Right. Well, I think just speaking for myself as someone who's, only been I've been working in AI for maybe 20 years now, again, as a computer scientist. Um, to me, speaking personally, it's a little surprising that suddenly we're having to deal with the ethical issues in AI because for some reason, for most of those 20 years, none of the technology, at least that I was involved in, really seemed to be working well enough to really impacting actual people's lives. And I think in the last few years, we've made substantial progress in AI, and that means now people are wanting to use it in regular products and day-to-day life, and that means we really need to confront some of these issues. And so I think there's like, again, it's kind of, there's good news and there's also sort of things that we need to work on. I think in terms of like the research community that I'm involved in, I think the good news is that now ethics in AI is really at the forefront of people's minds. When you submit a paper to many conferences these days, the top conferences in AI, they're now asking researchers to explicitly state what are sort of the potential ethical implications of a paper or work that you're doing. And your paper very well may be rejected if you can't make that argument. Um, so, but there's a lot of issues that I think computer scientists and us as a community need to think about in terms of AI. And I think they range from lots of things from, say, how we deal with the fact that AI is not perfect, so it's going to make errors. Those errors are going to impact people's lives, um, or they could impact people's lives if we're not careful. AI is not very good at like explaining its reasoning, so even when it makes an error, it's sort of hard to figure out why it made that error. There's concerns about bias, like there's recent work, for example, showing that face recognition tends to work much better in like white middle-aged men than it does in black older women, for example. That's a significant concern. And just like any technology that ties in, any new technology that ties into concerns about how AI might increase inequality, how it might affect some people's, some types of jobs, how it might affect employment or unemployment in the future. Um, and I think it also raises questions about like how AI will influence ourselves. Like, how are we going to let AI influence ourselves? Not in the sense that like robots might gain sentience and turn into like killer agents or something like that, but just like what does it look like in a world where maybe people are relying on AI to interact with one another, as we do, you know, by communicating on Facebook right now, and other technologies like that.
Very interesting. And I'm glad you touched on bias. Obviously, that's a word we, hear a lot thrown around with AI. So, David, switching gears just a little bit here, and you mentioned it in the beginning, but I'd like for you to expand a little bit on computer vision and what excites you about this.
Yeah. So I think the most exciting and interesting thing about computer vision is it is vision, being able to see seems like such a simple thing to us, right? From a very early age, we're able to recognize faces, recognize the objects that we see around us. We can give names to objects, right? It's one of the very first things that we learn to do in the first few months and years of life. And yet it has defied computer scientists now, for confounded computer scientists for now, for close to 60 years, and how to be able to replicate that ability. And it's sort of, it's so sort of confusing because, right, as a person, like I just look around and I see things and there's no conscious effort to that. And then I've spent 20 years and others have spent many more decades trying to program computers to do it. And it's just such a difficult, really difficult thing to do. So that's why it's exciting for me. I think it's a really interesting technical challenge. And also, as we confront that technical challenge, I think it also potentially helps us understand how people are able to solve this problem. And if we can do that, right, if we can understand how kids learn to see the world, maybe using computer vision as a lens, then maybe we can help, we can help kids who have learning deficiencies, for example, learning difficulties, like figure out strategies around them by sort of reverse engineering what's going on and figuring out how maybe to account for that. And in terms of a research sort of problem or community, I also like that it touches on so many different fields, because we have computer scientists, but it also touches on, optics and statistics and cognitive science and lots of different fields. So it's a great thing for students or faculty who are sort of interested in many things to bring them together in kind of this, relatively interdisciplinary field that's trying to solve a big challenge.
Excellent. All right. And David, before we wrap up here, obviously this has been a really interesting, that's a nice way to put it, year, difficult on many fronts for us. 2020 has thrown a lot at us, in the education space, obviously, in higher ed. Wow, having to shift so quickly to online fully. And it's been wild. So just touch on a little bit, if you would, from your end as a professor there, how have things changed? Besides the obvious, do you think it's this pandemic and the minds of some of your students has really changed how they look at their future career?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think in computer science, we're probably luckier than in other fields like, chemistry and biology and stuff, where all of the work that we tend to do is portable on our laptops and we can log into servers from wherever we are in the world. And the kinds of skills we're working on, like programming skills, are things that sort of are very naturally adapted to the online world. So in that way, we're lucky. And as an educator, I feel like, and I've heard this from other colleagues also, it's really been a mixed bag. Some things that we expected we would not enjoy about the online teaching have actually been great. For example, I routinely these days get 20, 30 students coming to my online office hours, whereas no one would have crammed, there's no way I could have crammed 20 or 30 students into my office hours in physical, in the real world. So, that's an example of actually where the technology is increasing the amount of engagement that we have one-on-one. But, I think there's in terms of computer scientists, I think the pandemic has in some ways been like good for technology, and there still seems to be a pretty good job market in computer science, for example. But like everybody else, I worry about the long-term impact on students' health and our own mental health by just not having those social connections that I think are really important. The more that I work in AI, the more impressed I am with people because people have been able to do all of these things, for thousands of years, and being able to interact with other people as social creatures is super important that I don't think we should try to replace with AI anytime soon.
Absolutely. Yeah, it always comes back to the humans. And I think we're all realizing too just how important that social interaction is. When you don't have it anymore, it's just critical. David, I've really enjoyed our time here together, and I appreciate you talking with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been fun.
Certainly. All right. Well, for much more, make sure you check out Tech Republic and ZDNet, and we appreciate you watching today.